Night shift horrors, true crime stories. The Veil of Night. The night has a way of softening the world, wrapping even the busiest of places in a heavy quiet. By day, cities breathe in bursts of motion, cars rushing, voices overlapping, lives colliding. But at night, when the lights dim and shutters are pulled closed, there is a different rhythm. One marked by the steady ticking of clocks, the far-off echo of a siren carried on the wind, and the faint hum of fluorescent bulbs that never sleep. For some, the night is when they rest, folding themselves into beds and drifting into dreams. For others, it is the beginning of work, a shift taken while the rest of the world lies vulnerable in sleep. It is during these hours, the long unbroken stretches of shadow, that reality bends in unsettling ways. Those who work the night shift know it well. The silence amplifies sound, footsteps echo louder, a door that creaks carries across an entire hall. A figure glimpsed at the edge of vision lingers longer, its shape refusing to dissolve into harmless shadow. Alone, surrounded by stillness, the mind begins to whisper, and those whispers often grow into fears that daylight cannot explain away. Yet the fear is not always imagined. Sometimes the night delivers more than shadows. It delivers those who hide within them, waiting for the cover of darkness to act. In convenience stores, offices, taxicabs, and gas stations, the veil of night has revealed the worst in human nature. Moments where ordinary jobs turned into chilling encounters, where the unseen became tragically real. It is these stories we will wander through now. A journey into the stillness of the night shift, where each tick of the clock stretches, where every sound feels like a presence, and where the fragility of safety is exposed. The first story begins in a small-town convenience store, the kind of place lit by buzzing bulbs that make the shadows at the edge of the room seem thicker than they are. It was just past 2 in the morning, that strange hour when the night feels both endless and fragile, as if something could break at any moment. First shift's shadow. The town of Grayford had long been quiet, unremarkable. Nestled between low ridges and a winding river, its streets emptied early in the evening. But the little convenience store at the edge of Main Street remained open, its neon sign humming against the darkness. Inside, a young clerk named Daniel was working his second overnight shift alone. He was 21, tired from classes during the day, and grateful for the paycheck, even if it meant watching the hours crawl by under unforgiving light. The air smelled faintly of coffee grounds and disinfectant, and the clock above the counter ticked with unnerving clarity. The streets outside were empty. Occasionally headlights swept past, briefly painting the shelves in silver. Daniel kept himself busy restocking bottled water, the cool plastic stinging his fingers, when the sound of the door chimed. He glanced up. A man had entered, tall, shoulders hunched, a dark hood pulled low over his face. His shoes made little sound on the tile. At first glance, he looked like any other late-night customer. People came and went at odd hours, truckers, shift workers, travelers passing through. But there was something about the man's stillness that caught Daniel's attention. Instead of browsing, the stranger walked slowly down the aisle, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. He moved without purpose, pausing in front of the snacks, then the drinks, though he never picked anything up. The way he lingered gave the air a heavier weight. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He tried to focus on the bottles in his hand, the repetitive comfort of stocking shelves. But his eyes kept drifting back to the figure. Minutes stretched. The man finally approached the counter. He stood there silently, his face shadowed by the hood, his breath steady but unnervingly slow. Daniel forced a smile. "Can I help you with something?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying his unease. No answer, only the rustle of fabric as the man shifted his weight. Then, without a word, a glint of metal appeared, a small pistol, lifted just enough to be seen. Daniel's heart lurched. The world seemed to narrow to the gleam of that weapon and the unspoken command behind it. The hum of the lights grew louder. The clock above the counter ticked impossibly slow. "Empty the register." The man's voice was low, almost casual. Hands trembling, Daniel did as he was told. Each bill felt heavier than paper, each coin ringing like thunder as it hit the counter. He tried not to look at the man, but the figure's presence filled the room like smoke, inescapable, suffocating. When the bag was full, the man snatched it, retreating without haste, as if certain of the silence around him. The door chimed once more, then closed. The night reclaimed its stillness. Daniel stood frozen, the echo of the man's voice still vibrating in his ears. The store was the same. The humming lights, the smell of coffee, but nothing felt familiar anymore. It was as though the place had been changed, marked by what had happened. It took him several minutes to call the police. His voice shook, and though they arrived quickly, the man was gone, absorbed into the night. The footage showed everything in cold clarity. A hooded man, a weapon, a trembling clerk, no shots fired, no blood spilled. Yet the violence of the moment lay in the silence, in the way the night seemed to hold its breath as one life was turned inside out. Daniel never returned to night shifts after that. He said the store felt haunted, not by spirits, but by memory. Every shadow at the edge of the aisle became a threat. Every chime of the door sent a jolt through his chest. Even sleep betrayed him, filled with dreams of standing at that counter, powerless as the figure emerged again and again. The money lost that night was replaced within a day. The fear, however, became permanent. It was a reminder that in the stillness of the night, the fragile line between ordinary and horrific can be crossed without warning. And in Grayford, whispers of the hooded man lingered long after. Some claimed to have seen him walking near the river late at night, tall and alone, his steps steady as if unhurried by time. The police who arrived that night were polite but distant, their words clipped, their movements efficient. They took Daniel's statement, asked him to walk them through the event again, then again. Each retelling made the memory sharper, not blurrier. Each time, Daniel felt as though he was stepping back into the moment, watching the man's shadow stretch across the counter, hearing the door chime echo behind him as he left. They told him he'd done the right thing. That money could be replaced, but lives could not. Daniel nodded, though the reassurance felt hollow. He knew that on some level, the clerk's job was to be replaceable. The next morning, another worker came in and the shelves were restocked, the register filled once more. But it was Daniel who carried the imprint of the night. The small town murmured about it for weeks. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, shaking their heads at the audacity of crime breaking through the quiet of Grayford. The newspapers wrote a brief column. It was, after all, a robbery without blood. It could have been worse, they said. The words were meant to comfort, but instead they left Daniel with the realization that people expected such things to happen in the night, as though the dark hours invited them in. He tried to return to his routine. Days at school, evenings with friends. Yet when midnight approached, when the air grew still, something inside him tightened. The store had been brightly lit, but still the shadows had moved around him, stretching from the shelves, leaning across the floor. In his dreams they grew taller, darker, until they pressed against him from all sides. And always, always there was the sound of the door chime cutting through silence. One night, weeks later, Daniel thought he saw him again. He was walking home, the cold air damp from the river's mist, when he noticed a figure across the street. Tall, shoulders hunched, a slow, steady pace. The figure didn't look at him, didn't change direction, only passed under the glow of a flickering lamp before vanishing into the distance. Daniel's breath caught. He never told anyone, not even the police, but from then on he avoided walking alone after dark. The store itself began to carry a reputation. Customers mentioned the robbery in passing, their voices quiet as if speaking of something sacred. Workers hesitated when asked to cover the overnight shift. It wasn't fear of another robbery alone, it was the memory of silence. The silence that stretched between a stranger's command and the sound of coins hitting the counter. The silence that lingers longer than noise ever does. For Daniel, life eventually moved forward. He found other work, away from the long fluorescent lit nights. But even years later, he admitted that he still startled at the sound of a bell above a doorway. He still avoided convenience stores after midnight. And when sleep eluded him, when he found himself awake in those hollow hours, he remembered the moment he looked into the shadowed hood and realized that the night itself could become a weapon. The story became one of many whispered in Grayford, stories that belonged not to newspapers, but to the people who lived with them. And though the man was never caught, his presence lingered. Not in fingerprints, not in evidence, but in the way people glanced over their shoulders, the way shadows in small shops seemed just a little darker. The veil of night had lifted for a moment, and behind it, something unsettling was revealed. Part 2, The Empty Office's Secret. The Empty Office's Secret. The sound of footsteps echoing through an empty building can be strangely unsettling. By day, those sounds blend into a chorus, the shuffle of shoes, the murmur of voices, the closing of doors. But at night, when the building lies hollow, every step seems to belong to someone intruding, even if it's your own. In Greyford, near the edge of the industrial district, there stood an office complex attached to a warehouse. During daylight hours, its windows reflected the river, its corridors alive with the clatter of keyboards and the thrum of machinery. But at night, the place seemed abandoned, a hollow husk kept alive by fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly against the silence. This was the world of Thomas Hale, a security guard who had spent the better part of 2 years watching over the building during its darkest hours. He was 40 years old, steady, reliable, the kind of man who valued routine. His children described him as patient, though his wife sometimes said he carried the weight of silence home with him, as though the hours he spent in deserted halls clung to him even after sunrise. Most nights were uneventful. He walked his rounds, checking doors, jotting notes, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos his wife filled for him before she went to bed. The building rarely offered surprises. A door left unlocked, a light forgotten. Once, a stray cat that had slipped inside and startled him with glowing eyes from under a desk. But silence can be deceiving. And one night, the silence broke. It was winter, and the air outside pressed against the glass in cold sheets. The river beyond the building had frozen at its edges, and the streets outside were almost deserted. Thomas walked the upper floor of the office, his boots steady on the linoleum. He paused at the end of the corridor, glancing down into the warehouse below. Rows of shelving stood like monoliths, stacked with boxes that seemed to vanish into the dim light. The place always unnerved him slightly. Too many corners, too many shadows where something might hide. He turned to continue his patrol when a sound reached him. Faint, a metallic clatter, like something shifting. He froze, listening. The building should have been empty. He had checked every door, every lock. The workers had left hours ago. The sound came again, sharper this time. A scrape, like a shoe against concrete. Thomas tightened his grip on his flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow path through the gloom. He made his way down to the warehouse, each step measured, his breath steady. He told himself it was nothing, a box settling, the building groaning in the cold. But years on the job had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about the sound felt deliberate. The warehouse was vast, the shelves rising high enough to block his view in every direction. He swept his light across the aisles, illuminating rows of cardboard, the glint of shrink wrap, the dust motes stirred by his breath. Silence again, then a soft thud. Thomas turned sharply, his heart ticking faster now. He moved toward the sound, the beam of his flashlight jittering against the boxes. As he turned into the next aisle, the light caught movement. A figure ducking low, slipping behind a stack. "Who's there?" His voice rang out, startling in the emptiness. No answer, only the fading echo of his words. Thomas's pulse hammered. He had no weapon beyond the baton at his side. His training told him to retreat, to call for backup, but pride and instinct pushed him forward. He couldn't ignore what he had seen. Someone was inside. He moved cautiously, every sense alert, the beam of his flashlight cutting into shadows that refused to retreat fully. His boots scraped softly against the floor. He turned another corner. The figure appeared suddenly, lunging from the dark. Thomas raised his arm instinctively. The flashlight knocked from his grip as hands struck his chest. He stumbled back, the cold edge of metal flashing in the dim. A struggle unfolded in silence, broken only by the harsh sound of breath and the dull thud of bodies against concrete. By morning, the workers who arrived found the door to the warehouse broken, papers scattered, and Thomas lying still near the end of an aisle. His flashlight lay yards away, its beam still faintly glowing. The intruder had vanished, leaving only overturned boxes and a trail of footprints that led into the night. The police investigation uncovered fragments. A door forced open, boxes disturbed, nothing stolen of value, at least nothing obvious. Some whispered it was simply a burglary gone wrong. Others believed it was something darker, a deliberate attack that found its opportunity in the silence of night. For the workers who returned, the warehouse never felt the same. The echo of footsteps carried differently. The hum of the lights seemed harsher, less steady. The aisles felt like corridors of shadow, each corner holding the possibility of someone waiting. And for Thomas's family, the silence of night became unbearable. His wife said she would wake often, expecting to hear the soft click of the door as he returned home at dawn, only to be met by the stillness of an empty house. The story spread through Grayford like a ripple. Some avoided the building altogether. Others swore they saw a tall figure walking the perimeter late at night, a walking stick tapping faintly against the ground, though no one could say for sure. The empty office carried its secret, one that daylight could not erase. It was a reminder that even the most ordinary places, an office, a warehouse, a place of work, could transform under the weight of night. And in that transformation, the boundary between safety and peril could vanish without a sound. The days after the incident stretched long and uneasy. For those who worked in the building, the return to routine was forced, brittle. The daylight hours were filled with productivity again, phones ringing, printers humming, forklifts moving through the warehouse, but beneath it all lingered a thin layer of unease. Some said they could still sense Thomas's presence. The workers who had known him described him as a quiet guardian, a steady figure who made them feel safe as they left late in the evening. Without him, the building felt exposed, vulnerable. The corridors carried a heavier silence now, and no one wanted to be the last to leave. The warehouse floor where he had been found became a place people avoided when they could. The faint scuffs on the concrete, the overturned box that had never been righted, the crack in the doorframe, it all remained like scars, unhealed and raw. The company repaired what was necessary, but the atmosphere could not be mended. The police investigated as thoroughly as they could, but answers never seemed to arrive. Theories circulated instead, whispered in break rooms and at the diner across from the plant. Some insisted it had been a burglary gone wrong, that Thomas had simply startled a desperate man who wanted nothing more than to escape. Others leaned toward darker speculation, that someone had planned it, had known his routine, had been waiting for the moment when he was most alone. One night, weeks later, another guard on duty swore he heard the sound of footsteps pacing the warehouse. He followed, flashlight steady, nerves sharp, but found no one. Yet when he returned to his station, the security cameras had gone fuzzy, static blooming across the monitors for several minutes before clearing again. Stories like that spread quickly, blurring the line between fact and imagination. A janitor claimed to have heard someone whisper his name when he was alone on the second floor. An office assistant said she glimpsed a tall man through the glass doors one night, though when she looked again, the sidewalk was empty. Each account layered onto the next, building a tapestry of fear that daylight could not wash away. The company eventually rotated guards more frequently, refusing to let anyone work alone for long stretches. But the memory of Thomas's final shift lingered. His wife kept his thermos, still faintly smelling of coffee, on a shelf in their kitchen. His children avoided the industrial district altogether, unwilling to pass the place that had swallowed their father's last hours. In Grayford, the story joined the growing chorus of night shift horrors. It was spoken of in low tones at the bar near the river, where truckers stopped for coffee in the early hours. People warned newcomers not to take the late shifts if they could help it. Not because crime was common, but because the silence itself seemed dangerous, an invisible accomplice to whatever cruelty the night might bring. One worker who had known Thomas best put it simply, the night makes things easy to hide, and sometimes what it hides doesn't want to be found. That sentiment clung to the building long after, until it became part of its identity. An office by day, a hushed mausoleum by night. And still, people whispered about the figure who may have slipped out into the cold air, disappearing down the narrow streets of Grayford. Tall, steady, unhurried, as though he knew he would not be caught. The empty office had revealed its secret, but not its truth. And the truth, as with so many stories born in the hours after midnight, may have been swallowed whole by the darkness. Part 3, Graveyard Shift's grim reality. The graveyard shift is unlike any other. It is the space between yesterday and tomorrow when cities appear empty, and the few who move through them do so with a kind of urgency, as though chased by something unseen. For taxi drivers, for gas station attendants, for those whose jobs depend on the steady trickle of strangers, the night is a double-edged companion. It offers quiet roads, fewer interruptions, and sometimes the solitude they prefer. But it also strips away witnesses, leaving them face to face with whoever steps into their space, with no guarantee of who that might be. In Grayford, one such night began simply. A taxi driver named Javier had worked the late shift for over a decade. He preferred it. The streets were easier to navigate, the fares steady enough. He knew the regulars, the factory workers finishing overtime, the nurses heading home after 12 hours on their feet, the college students too tired to walk across town. But on a cold autumn morning, just after 3, Javier picked up 2 men outside a bar. They laughed too loudly, the kind of laughter meant to cover irritation. They smelled of stale beer, their words slurred but sharp. At first, the ride seemed typical. They asked to be taken across the river, toward the quieter part of town. But halfway over the bridge, their laughter dissolved. One leaned forward, pressing something cold and unmistakable against Javier's neck. "Keep driving," the man muttered. The other rifled through Javier's pockets, yanking his wallet free. The cab swerved once, tires screeching, before Javier, his heart hammering, made a decision he would later struggle to explain. He floored the accelerator, steering sharply toward the exit ramp, where he knew a police cruiser often sat during late hours. The sudden speed startled his attackers. As the blue and red lights of a patrol car flared in the distance, the men cursed, panicked, and flung open the doors before the cab had fully stopped. They disappeared into the night, leaving Javier trembling behind the wheel, breathless but alive. The officers took his statement, searched the area, but the men were never found. For Javier, the cab became something different after that night. The seats, once worn with the comfort of routine, felt like traps. The mirror no longer reflected just the road, but the lingering possibility of what could sit behind him. He drove only days after that, unwilling to face the long emptiness of Grayford's nights again. Not all graveyard workers had the luxury of escape. At a gas station along the old highway, another story was whispered often. A young attendant named Meredith worked the counter, her hours marked by the steady rhythm of pumps clicking on and off. Most nights were predictable, truckers filling up, tired travellers stopping for coffee. But one night around 2:30, a car pulled up and idled longer than usual. Meredith watched from the counter, waiting for the driver to step out, but no one did. Minutes passed and the unease grew. Finally, the door opened and a man emerged, tall, his stride deliberate. He walked not to the pump, but directly toward the glass door. When he entered, Meredith greeted him politely, masking the sudden tightness in her chest. The man said nothing. He wandered briefly among the aisles, his hands brushing against items, but never lifting them. Then, with unsettling calm, he approached the counter and leaned closer than most customers would. "You're here alone," he said, his voice flat, almost curious. Meredith nodded, unable to find words. The man smiled faintly, though it never reached his eyes. He tapped his fingers against the counter, then turned and walked out. His car pulled away slowly, swallowed by the empty road. No crime had been committed, no money stolen, no weapon drawn. Yet Meredith quit within the week. She told friends later that it was the certainty in his words that haunted her, that the man hadn't asked a question but stated a fact as though confirming what he already knew. These were the truths of the graveyard shift. Danger came not only in violence but in presence. In this way, strangers could step into silence and bend it, leaving behind scars invisible to others. Taxi drivers, gas station clerks, night attendants, each bore witness to the fragile veil between routine and threat. And in Grayford, as elsewhere, their stories wove into the fabric of the town's nights, whispered to those who dared to take up the shifts others avoided. For the world may sleep, but in the stillness of the graveyard shift, not all shadows are empty. Part 4. Beyond the Dawn. There comes a moment each night when the air begins to change. The darkness is still heavy, but a faint edge of it softens, the way shadows seem less absolute, the way silence feels less permanent. It is the slow arrival of dawn, when the longest hours of the night have passed, though the sun has yet to rise. For night workers, this hour is a threshold. Some feel relief, knowing the world is stirring awake again, that the loneliness will soon break. Others feel the exhaustion more keenly here, as though the weight of all they've endured presses hardest just before release. In Greyford, the stories of night shifts linger through this fragile space. Daniel, the young clerk, who learned in a single moment that the hum of a convenience store could transform into a stage for fear. Thomas Hale, the guard, whose steady routine carried him into the silence of a warehouse where shadows hid more than dust. Javier, who drove his taxi across empty bridges, only to find himself staring at his own survival in the glow of red and blue lights. Meredith, who learned that sometimes danger does not shout or strike. It only observes quietly with the certainty that someone is alone. Each story belongs to a different place, a different worker, yet all share the same undercurrent, vulnerability, magnified by hours when the world is supposed to sleep. The night does not merely cloak streets and buildings, it transforms them. What feels ordinary at midday becomes foreign in the stillness of 2 or 3 in the morning. Even those who never worked a night shift know this instinctively. Step into a grocery store long after midnight, and the aisles seem wider, emptier, the buzz of lights a little harsher. Walk through an office after hours, and the echo of your footsteps feels louder than it should. Drive down a road at 3 a.m., and every set of headlights seems to carry a story you'll never know. The night changes the rules, and sometimes the night keeps its secrets. Greyford has grown used to whispers, about the hooded man at the river, whose shape is seen but never approached. About the figure outside the office windows, tall, unhurried, a walking stick tapping faintly against the ground. About the way the weather has not changed in weeks, the sky heavy with the same low clouds, as though holding the town in suspension. Some say these are just fragments, details strung together by tired workers and anxious minds. Others believe the stories connect, that the same shadows move quietly through all of them, weaving the lives of the night shift into a larger tapestry of unease. Perhaps the night is not simply empty, but occupied by things we cannot name. And yet each morning workers return home. They cross their thresholds, shed uniforms, pour coffee, slip into bed still warm from the hours before. Life goes on. The world forgets what they have carried. The night recedes into silence once more, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. But for those who lived through it, the memory remains. Not only of what happened, but of what might have. For fear is not always about what has already occurred. It is about what the night suggests, what it leaves possible. As you listen now, perhaps you feel the quiet pressing in. Perhaps you notice the steady rhythm of your own space, the hum of an appliance, the faint creak of a wall, the distant sounds carried in the night air. These details may feel harmless, ordinary, and they are, until they are not. The night shift teaches this lesson better than anything else, that the line between safety and threat is thinner than most realize. That silence itself can become a companion or a warning, and that sometimes what we fear is not only what we see, but what remains unseen just at the edge of the light. So when dawn finally breaks, when the first birds call out and the weight of shadow lifts, remember the ones who walk through that veil each night. The clerks, the guards, the drivers, the attendants, each of them living in the fragile hours where most of us dare not look too closely. And remember, too, the stories they carry. For though the world brightens, the night always returns, and with it the possibility that somewhere, someone is waiting in the silence, watching, unhurried. The veil of night does not vanish, it only thins. Soft fade, the ticking clock slows, distant sirens fade into morning silence, leaving only stillness. If you've ever worked through those hours, if you've stood in a store with shadows at your back, patrolled empty corridors, driven across bridges when the city slept, or kept watch in a place where you were the only voice alive, share your story below. Perhaps in the telling, the silence feels a little less heavy. Perhaps in the listening, someone else will feel less alone.